The evening of June 27, 1988, in Paris began like any other busy weekday in the dense network of commuter lines feeding into the heart of the city, with trains running in and out of the Gare de Lyon station carrying thousands of passengers who were either returning from work or traveling across the region. The SNCF Suburban Electric Multiple Unit, classified as AZ 5300, designated as Train 153944, departed from Melun on its regular commuter route, but unlike previous days, a new summer timetable had just been introduced, altering scheduled stops to optimize traffic flow and reduce congestion. Among the stations removed from the schedule was Le Vert de Maisons, a seemingly small change but one that would trigger a chain of events no scheduler, engineer, or passenger could have predicted would end in one of the deadliest rail disasters in modern France. On board that train was a young mother named Odile Miroir, who had taken the same service daily and was accustomed to disembarking at Le Vert de Maisons so she could collect her children from childcare nearby. As the train approached the station and did not slow down as it normally did, she realized too late that the stop had been removed from the schedule, and in a moment of panic she pulled the emergency brake handle inside the second carriage, thinking she could force the train to stop and allow herself and possibly others to get off. The emergency brake engaged, stopping the train on the tracks, and the sudden halt set everything in motion. The driver, a man named Daniel Solon, along with the onboard guard Jean-Charles Bovy, disembarked to investigate the reason for the abrupt stop. They located Miroir, who admitted she had pulled the brake because she missed her stop, unaware that the decision would inadvertently contribute to one of the most catastrophic failures in French railway history. Resetting the emergency brake on these Z5300 model trains was a manual process that required a series of technical steps, including manipulating valves that controlled the pneumatic braking system. Unknown to Solon and Bovy at that moment, during their attempt to reset the system and repressurize the brake lines, Solon mistakenly closed a crucial valve on the main brake pipe that supplied air pressure to the rear carriages. The Z5300 units relied heavily on pneumatic pressure distributed evenly along the train to maintain effective braking, and with that valve mistakenly closed, the rear section of the train was now disconnected from the main braking system, meaning that only the front portion retained partial braking capability. Despite this critical error, the resetting process took nearly 26 minutes, causing the train to fall significantly behind schedule. In response to the growing delay, the station controller at Maisons-Alfort, named André Talents, instructed the train to skip the next scheduled stop at Maisons-Alfort, Alfortville, in an attempt to recover lost time and avoid further disruption to the network. This instruction meant that the train would continue without slowing down again before reaching the steep descending approach into Gare de Lyon's underground suburban terminal. The approach to the underground platforms at Gare de Lyon involved a significant downward gradient, roughly a 4% descent, which was normally manageable with proper braking. However, because the brake pipe supplying most of the train had been accidentally isolated, when Solon attempted to begin slowing the train on this descent, he discovered with horror that the brakes were barely responsive. Realizing that the train was now accelerating uncontrollably down into one of the busiest terminal stations in Paris, he grabbed his radio to issue an emergency warning, but in his stress and urgency he failed to identify himself or specify his train number clearly, which caused confusion in the control room. He then activated the general alarm function on the radio, a signal that automatically overrode the normal camera and route programming systems and set all signals to red across the section of the network. Under normal conditions, the network's automatic signaling would have directed any inbound train with a failure toward an empty track. In this case, Platform 1, which had been intentionally kept vacant as a safety buffer. But the activation of the general closure protocol disabled this automation and handed full control to human operators, who at that moment, due to the unclear radio communication, did not understand that the runaway train was seconds away from entering the station without functioning brakes. Meanwhile, in the Gare de Lyon underground terminal, another Z5300 suburban train, outbound and waiting on Platform 2, was standing still, loading passengers for departure. Its driver, André Tanguy, was in his cab performing routine pre-departure checks and making announcements. The platform was crowded, packed with commuters walking, boarding, chatting among themselves, unaware that a train was barreling toward them with no ability to stop. Back on the runaway train, Solon, knowing a collision was now almost inevitable, left his driving position and moved through the carriages shouting for passengers to get to the rear as quickly as possible, hoping that would reduce casualties by moving them away from the front impact point. Some passengers screamed, others froze, many too shocked to process what was happening. In the control room, the lack of clear identification from Solin's emergency transmission combined with the overridden automatic routing system meant that controllers did not divert the train to the empty Platform 1. Instead, the system held the manually set path, routing the runaway straight into Platform 2 where the stationary train was still sitting. In the final moments before impact, witnesses described hearing a strange rushing sound coming from the tunnel, a deep metallic roar that echoed through the underground space. A security camera captured the last seconds, the headlights piercing the tunnel darkness before the train slammed violently into the rear of the waiting train. The force of the impact drove the stationary train forward by nearly 30 meters, crushing the front carriages of both units. The confined underground structure amplified the force of destruction as metal compressed into metal with a scream of twisting steel, glass exploded into lethal fragments, and passengers were thrown violently against seats, windows, and one another. The first car of the runaway train was almost entirely destroyed, compacted like paper, while the second car suffered catastrophic structural failure. The driver of the stationary train, André Tanguy, remained at his post until the last moment, continuing to speak over the intercom telling passengers to move out and keep calm, sacrificing his own chance to escape. He was killed instantly in the collision. The underground platform descended into chaos, dust and smoke filling the air, the smell of burning electrical cables mixing with blood and oil. Emergency services flooded the site, but the tight space and mangled wreckage made rescue operations agonizingly slow. Many victims were trapped between warped steel and crushed seats, their screams echoing in the dimly lit underground cavern. Firefighters used hydraulic cutters to tear through the carriages, working in extreme heat and emotional pressure as they pulled survivors out through shattered windows and sliced open walls of the train cars. Bodies were laid out on the platform under emergency blankets as medics tried to prioritize the living. Some victims had been killed instantly, others died trapped and crushed before rescuers could reach them. In total, 56 people lost their lives and 57 were seriously injured, making it the deadliest peacetime rail disaster in France's history. The investigation that followed examined every technical and human element involved. It concluded that the closure of the brake pipe was the initial technical failure, compounded by the instruction to skip the station, the failure to properly identify the emergency call, and the disabling of the automated routing system which would have diverted the runaway train to an empty track had it not been interrupted by the general closure protocol. Legal proceedings were launched and a number of individuals were brought to trial, including driver Daniel Solin, guard Jean-Charles Bovy, station supervisor André Talents, and even the passenger Odile Miroir, whose panic-driven decision to pull the emergency brake was judged as misuse of emergency equipment. Solin was initially sentenced to 4 years in prison for negligent homicide with 6 months to be served, while Miroir was fined 1,000 francs. However, on appeal, Solin's sentence was reduced to a suspended 6 months and several charges against others were softened or overturned, leading many to believe that SNCF officials had allowed individuals to become scapegoats instead of acknowledging systemic operational flaws. Public reaction was intense, and families of the victims formed associations to demand accountability and better safety protocols. The disaster led to major reforms in French railway safety, including the mandatory installation of energy-absorbing buffer systems at terminal platforms, improvements in emergency communication procedures, redesign of brake reset mechanisms to prevent isolation of critical pipes by mistake, and stricter rules on manual overrides during emergencies. The emotional scar of the disaster remained long after the wreckage was cleared, with survivors recounting haunting memories of screams in the dark and the moment of impact repeating endlessly in their minds. The Gare de Lyon disaster stands today not just as a tragic event but as a reminder of how a series of small errors, miscommunications, and overlooked safety systems can combine in a single moment to produce a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, where human lives were lost not due to one large failure, but a chain of small, preventable ones that converged in the most devastating way possible.